Alright. This is serving as a sequel to a video I've made before. This is the flying machine number 2. It is roughly the same size. Let me pull up the other one for scale. Ah, never mind. It is fairly smaller, which is very nice. It is fairly small in comparison. Ooh, they don't like being near each other. That lagged my computer a little bit. Much smaller in comparison. But it kind of takes up relatively the same blueprint, or footprint, I mean, just because of these thrusters sticking out like this, the way that they are. But anyways, now to the actual functionality. I would do a comparison, but it's pretty easy to do a comparison. You could just look at the other video and see how it behaves. This one is much more stable and much easier to fly. I don't know why I placed my lift there, but who cares? So, firstly, you get in the seat. It is button controlled. However, I have my buttons rebound to I, J, K, and L to use as a secondary WASD keyboard setup because the spacing between the keys are very similar. But you hit 5 to turn it on. It does initially lean backwards a little bit, but it will correct itself very gradually like that. And it is almost entirely stationary at this point in time. This thing is actually very slightly back-heavy, which is why to counteract that, these sensors are set to 16, or those are set to 15, which actually almost perfectly counterbalances it. I say that as it is moving forward, but compared to when they were set to 15, it would glide backwards much more quickly. And at this point, it's actually even stopped again. But regardless, this one reaction wheel, this is the only reaction wheel on the craft, is for steering. You see I also have turning lights to indicate what direction I'm steering. And it's actually very responsive. You might think there would be a little bit of carryover from the time I let go of the key to the time I actually stop turning, but because the wheel stops rotating instantaneously, that provides exactly enough counter torque to undo the rotation. Just because of, how the counter torque works. It just stops in its track because the wheel stops in its tracks. So it's actually very nice, precise movement. And then in terms of actual translation, there is no strafe control. However, you can yaw, so that doesn't matter. To actually move forward, you use the same thrusters that are actually for balancing. There are no additional thrusters. It's just these 8. So you lean forwards. It's kind of helicopter control. So you kind of move forward in the direction that you're leaning. And if you want to slow down, firstly, if you let go, it will kind of do that automatically, just because of its center of mass, which was not intentional, but it's really cool. But there is a reverse function. It's symmetrical. It works the same way as the forward, just mirrored. And you can see I have forward lights and brake lights, in addition to, just the turning lights and all these decorative lights. But it's actually, obviously if you just hold it, it's just going to lean forward like that and mess up. But, excuse me. However, if you can actually get away with a lot of lean, like this much lean. It's quite slow acceleration, I will say. But even so, you can get going pretty fast. Like, I don't even hit the floor there. I could have if I was being more negligent. Like, I got into a bit of an oscillation that I failed to control. This is a very poor demonstration. I can fly this thing much better normally. That's just because of my mistakes, not because of the thing's fallibility. But it's actually fairly maneuverable. It can get to quite some decent speed. Faster than I was able to demonstrate there, but now when it comes to landing, it does do this annoying thing where it kind of drifts around. However, in this case, it happened to come to a stop. That actually happens surprisingly often, more often than you'd think. But if you still need to come to a stop, just yaw, and then pitch, yaw, pitch, etc. Which, it comes to a stop actually fairly easily. It's not easy to tell just from this video, but it is actually not too difficult to get it to come to a complete stop. And then my favorite part about this whole thing is that I had it fine-tuned so that when I stop hitting the, or when I unflip the 5 switch, it comes down to the ground and lands perfectly. I fine-tuned that for like a long time to get that to work properly. And it's consistent too. As long as you like come to a complete stop, and even if there is some amount of movement, but it works best at complete stop, you come perfectly level with the ground. You let go, you sink down, and it's the smoothest possible landing you can imagine. It's incredible. I love that thing. And initially, there was actually an older version of this thing, an earlier prototype, where, because of how I had the logic set up to continue going for exactly 3.5 seconds, and then turn off once at the time that it hits the ground, because of how I had the logic set up, when you put it on the lift, you just kind of see a little tiny artifact of it there. The thrusters would turn on. But in the old prototype, they would turn on for the full 3.5 seconds before turning off. So they would just be sitting on the ground with the hover thrusters on. Which, it doesn't do anything, because the hover thrusters only cancel out the mass. These are actually required, the stability thrusters are actually required to get off the ground, so it's not any cause for concern. However, it was visually unsatisfying. But I had an additional problem, and these problems actually ended up kind of canceling out. Initially, before these two logic gates were here, this logic gate right here was not doing anything. Ignore this connection, that was not there yet. This was an empty logic gate doing absolutely nothing. But every single other logic gate in the entire craft had a purpose. So the only reason that this one particularly was here was for symmetry purposes, to make it not look asymmetrical. So I could solve both of those problems at once by using this logic gate to do that. So I did so by first adding these two. This one has nothing connected to it, so it is still not really doing anything. However, it is serving as the input to this NOR gate. Because this logic gate will never turn on because it has no inputs, this NOR gate will turn on 1 tick after the craft is spawned. But this NOR gate, its only input is this other NOR gate. So, at the time the craft is spawned, this NOR gate is by default off, so this one turns on. 1 tick, or after 1 tick, rather. Then 1 tick later, because this one is on, this logic gate turns back off, so it effectively is a 1 tick pulse, which requires 3 logic gates. So by adding these two, which is a more or less symmetrical thing, because on the back I have this controller and this switch, making it impossible to, put it on both sides. Just by adding these two logic gates, I can use this to actually, because it's mandatory to make this work. If this doesn't have an input, even though it has no inputs, it will still default to off. But because this thing isn't doing anything, this turns on and creates the 1 tick pulse, which triggers this logic gate that's currently active immediately, which triggers the hover system, which cancels out the signal that happens later, like 1 tick later, so that the thrusters do not activate. Except they do it for 1 tick, and then they stop, or that might be even 2 ticks. But it's so short, if you listen closely. It doesn't even play the thruster sound, because it does not even activate for long enough for the thruster sound to take place. But yeah, I was really proud of the ability of this thing to do that, such a soft landing. And then, I guess the last test I should show you. For the last one, I showed you a stability test. Where I hit it with my hammer. This one... Wow, that was way different from what it did last time. What? I guess... Okay, this is the first time I've hit the thruster, I guess. That's actually something I hadn't tested before. If I hit the main body of the craft, actually is very different. Unless it's just going to suddenly be different this time. Wow, it is going to suddenly be different this time. Interesting. It doesn't, like, sudden impulse, I guess. If you hit it with a sudden level of acceleration, it freaks out slightly. But for any small deviation, like this spud gun, even if I spam it a little bit, it'll kind of move. But it won't really rotate at all. It's very strange that the hammer had such a large effect, because last time I did that, like, you know, same distance from the center, so it should be the same torque. But it had, like, very little of an effect, and I had assumed it was because of the massive weight of the reaction wheel, but I suppose I was mistaken. But, so yeah, not as good as the sledgehammer test, just because it's lighter weight, because, I mean, again, remember how big this one is? It has 8 satellite dishes, and despite the fact that, you know, the satellite dish is very small and thin, oh, never mind, actually quite light. I would have sworn those were the main contributor of mass. I am misremembering. But again, it has, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 8, 12, 16... wow, hold on, this one has a total of 24 thrusters, yeah. So that's why that one's so much significantly heavier, which is why it doesn't move nearly as much, just because it has so much more inertia, more mass to get moving. Because thrusters are like... Really? Man, That's interesting. I would have thought thrusters weighed more. I'm wrong again. Whatever. In general, this thing is just larger, so it weighs more. That's what I'm getting at. So, but yeah, I guess it doesn't do as well in harsh conditions, but generally, like if I just turn this on really quick. Wow, this thing takes a while to get off the ground. I forgot. This thing, in comparison, maintains altitude much more effectively under, like, usual circumstances. Like, you can see this one's bobbing very slightly. This one, I guess it's a little difficult to tell, but it doesn't bob nearly as much. It is leaning forward, and it does do that consistently. There isn't much you can do about that if you have a craft that's much more asymmetrical, unlike this one. The game is getting angry because they're getting close to each other. Alright, there we go. But you can definitely see this one bobs probably about, like, judging on in-game distance, looks like a couple of centimeters. While this one, it, like, remains perfectly level. There's, like, a tiny vibration, but it's not even, I wouldn't even call it an oscillation. It's just, like, a buzz in the position. It could literally boil down just to floating point errors, with only little exaggeration in that statement. But yeah, in terms of altitude management, okay, the big takeaway from this one is much worse at angle management. It consistently will lean forwards. but it is much better at altitude management, as opposed to this one, where it's not at quite as good at the altitude management, but it is significantly better at the angle management, because, for example, this one, of course, when I hit it, it will change its angle. That's kind of unavoidable. But eventually it does come to a stop in terms of rotation. As opposed to this one. Okay, well, they both come to a stop. It's just that this one goes horizontal. But yeah, that's about it. Oh, I guess I have aesthetic choices, I guess. The reason I like this one better, one, the turning signals, they're fun. Two, it's much smaller, much more bare bones. Three, it has suspension cushioning, so when you turn these on, very slightly, they kind of wiggle. And that actually has a decent effect. Might be the main contributor as to why this one is so perfectly stable in altitude, because these don't have any suspension. They're like hard welded onto the main craft, while this has some amount of leniency, some amount of give to it. But yeah, and then what's cool about this is that the rotating sensor setup, the one that kind of, it sweeps against the floor to simulate variable thrust. There's a name for that term. I don't remember what it was. I looked it up a little bit ago because it applied to this. It's attached to the thruster, which is very, very cool. And there's a lot of controller bearings. In order to set that up, I actually had to use 2 controllers because there were 12, which is just over the limit of 10. Annoying, but gotta do what you gotta do. And then there's the kind of somewhat cursed picture of the little ramp light being gone through by this suspension, but it doesn't cause any problems. But yeah, I definitely like this choice over having them just mounted at the corners like this one is. But yeah, now I believe that's about it. And I only had to glitch weld one time, right there, just because gas engines are 2 wide, but this whole thing needs to be 3 wide to work. But yeah, that's about it.